everyone, I'm Trish Lynch from IOHR TV. Welcome to NGO Focus. Freedom of expression is at its lowest point in 10 years. The world has been witnessing a huge threat to press freedom, freedom of expression and the ability to access information. 2018 marks the brutal murder of journalist Kamal Khashoggi. And there are more than 200 journalists remain behind bars on fabricated charges, and the numbers keep rising. With us today is Thomas Hughes, Executive Director of Article 19, a human rights organisation monitoring and campaigning for freedom of expression worldwide. Mr. Hughes, great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Welcome.
Can you tell us more about Article 19? How did it start?
Well, Article 19 was founded 30 years ago. And it comes out of the family of organisations that were founded around about the same time as Amnesty International. And at that time, there was a feeling amongst specific individuals that there needed to be a specific focus on freedom of expression and information. So that's where it has its genesis from.
In your recent report, you said that freedom of expression is at its lowest point for 10 years. Tell me why you think that is, and how is it possible to measure something like this? How do you quantify it?
To the measurement point first, we produce every year a metric. It's called the Expression Agenda metric. We map freedom of expression across a number of different areas, across transparency, digital, media, protection, and civic space. And we work with an academic or a series of academic institutions under the umbrella of VDEM, and they measure a number of different indicators across all countries in the world, and we extract from that and marry that together with our own information, but we extract from that the data that's specific to freedom of expression. In terms of why we're at this particular situation or at this particular juncture, we see a number of converging trends, but I think the two really big ones are, firstly, the rise of the strongman politician, whether it be Putin, whether it be Erdogan, whether it be Bolsonaro. This swing to the right has seen increasing specific degradation of journalists and human rights defenders, but also the systematic attack and erosion of the structures, the legal structures, the media independent structures that are the core foundation of press freedom. 24
countries have shown a decline in freedom of expression between 2014 and 2017, and some of them are democratic states. How is it possible that countries like the US and Poland are in clear violation of Article 19?
I wouldn't necessarily argue that they're in clear violation of Article 19 in terms of Article 19 from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I would say that they are slipping across a number of different areas. The two key ones would be legal standards, so that could encompass a number of different particular standards from defamation through to the independence of the media and regulatory structures. And I think that the other areas around this swing to the right, this political discourse, the fact that it's become legitimate to denigrate, to attack journalists, to attack human rights defenders, to attack anyone who's actually in opposition, and the way that electorates have reacted to that, in support of that in many cases, which I think unto itself has a number of different contributing factors.
Do you think that President Trump and his insightful rhetoric is dangerous and it's only adding to further clampdowns on reporters?
Yes, I certainly do. In terms of the murders of journalists, which is often used as the kind of key measure to look at freedom of expression, of course it's only one specific one, we see a very worrying trend around the world. We see more journalists, so 3 in Europe and 4 in the United States, who have been murdered in the last year. Now, I'm not attributing those directly to President Trump, but there is an increased denigration of media. There is the use of the slogan, the words, the phrase, fake news, and it's purposely designed to sideline and to make sure that the role of the media is undermined in terms of exposing a light and having a spotlight on the actions of politicians and any other vested interest power.
At IOHR, we've been doing a lot of work on Turkey, and we know it's the largest jailer of journalists. Tell me if you've had direct connection with Turkish officials, and do you feel that there's a definite room for improvement in 2019?
There is undoubtedly room for improvement. I mean, there is unfortunately
huge room for improvement, really, isn't there?
Enormous room, I would say. It could also get worse, so we shouldn't be naive about that. We do lobby authorities around the world. That includes the Turkish authorities. We do that through the Human Rights Council. We do that directly in country, and we try and do that via other governments and their relationships with the Turkish authorities as well. So we are trying to be as vocal as possible towards the Turkish authorities to try and ensure that there is a course correction, that all of these journalists who are imprisoned and are being persecuted by the authorities, that stops, that the judiciary is given the proper independence it deserves, and the erosion of the independence of various different parts of government is reversed.
Do you believe that there's any possibility for a journalist to have a fair trial in Turkey at the moment?
I think the opportunities are very limited, very slim. We have seen some courts, some brave judges making good, impartial decisions in court cases, but I would say that's the exception.
Can you tell me how many journalists were killed in 2018, and do you have any idea how many have been jailed according to your records? Because the figures do vary considerably, don't they?
They do vary considerably, 70 to 80. In terms of murders during 2018, which is approximately similar to the previous year and slightly down on 2016. I instinctively actually dislike talking about numbers to try and measure whether there's progress or not, because one is too many, regardless of whether it's 70 or 150.
Yeah.
Over the last 10 years, we've seen almost 1,000 journalists being murdered, and the extremely worrying aspect of that is that impunity stands at 90% for those murders. In terms of jail journalists, we're looking at a figure that's between 350 and 400. Again, it varies very broadly.
Yeah.
But the countries that we're talking about there are Turkey, are Egypt, and are China. Those are the key countries. So the majority of those jailed journalists are in only a very small handful of countries.
It is quite worrying, isn't it, that most of the imprisoned journalists tend to be local journalists who are reporting what's happening on the ground. How do you monitor what's happening? Do you send teams in to monitor court proceedings? How do you manage all this?
We have 10 offices around the world with about 160 staff. And those offices are national offices, or in some cases regional, but they're grounded in the countries they're in. So they engage directly with journalists, but with human rights defenders or bloggers or whoever we feel is under threat. And we can support them in a number of different ways. We can support them with emergency support. We help create safety mechanisms so that journalists and others can work together to support one another. We do trial monitoring. We engage in court cases as well. Yeah. We also engage with state authorities around reform of legislation, but also to try and get them to adhere to and implement international standards. And on top of that, we engage in regional bodies and United Nations and international bodies as well.
Let's talk a bit more about freedom of expression. 312 human rights defenders were murdered in 2017. Tell me a bit more about some of these people. Who are they and what were they fighting for?
Well, the biggest single group are environmental defenders. And as you pointed out earlier, the ones who are most vulnerable are those who are working with indigenous communities or in rural areas outside of cities. And they are a group who are extremely vulnerable. We increasingly work with environmental human rights defenders from an expression perspective, because quite often what they're doing is trying to access information, but also share that information and make sure that that becomes public knowledge.
Do you think that having a special envoy at the UN just to handle the safety of journalists would make a difference? I know it's something that many NGOs have endorsed because they believe it is the right thing. It's the #ProtectJournalists campaign. Do you think that would be a good idea? Do you think it should happen?
I think the United Nations has many existing mechanisms which are extremely welcome. Those mechanisms need to be used. We need to make better use of what exists. I certainly think a special representative to the Secretary General would be a welcome addition to that family of different tools and different processes, but it would not and should not be seen as a replacement to those. 9 press freedom organisations have called on the Houses of Lords to recommend amendments to the counter-terror powers designed to tackle the vaguely defined crime of hostile state activity. If you would, tell me how that draft of the bill has affected press freedom and the protection of journalists and their sources, and what was the response that you got? When looking at pieces of legislation in any country, but including the United Kingdom, it's extremely important that there's clarity around definition. The potential impact of, when we look at counter-terrorism, for instance, the potential impact of opening up something that becomes very broad and very vague is that individuals who have opinions that run contrary to state opinions, or individuals who have controversial opinions, or an individual who says, I don't subscribe to a violent act, but I think the aims of this community are legitimate, which could be a very legitimate thing to say and a very important thing to say, suddenly that might fall foul these pieces of legislation. And suddenly an individual may find themselves facing prison time.
People who are watching this programme who are no doubt fascinated, where can they go to find out more information and to get a more in-depth idea of what Article 19 is all about?
Article19.org, and please follow us on Twitter as well.
Mr. Hughes, thank you for joining us today and sharing with us the great work of Article 19. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we thank you for joining us for another episode of NGO Focus. Please do share this with your wider community because raising awareness is what it's all about. Thank you for joining us and we look forward to seeing you for the next episode. Until then, from myself, Trish Lynch, goodbye.